Hello and welcome back to the EXPOSOME Stories. Today we will discuss the practical aspects of wearing a sunscreen. Simply put, we will address a few doubts and questions that stand between us and regular sunscreen use. In particular, let's look at the most common reasons why people do not like wearing sunscreens, and then we will look at overcoming those obstacles as much as we can. The first thing is acne. According to an informal clinical study carried out at Render sometime back, nearly a decade ago, to find out why people do not like wearing sunscreens, the second most common cause was acne breakouts. The first cause at that point was a lack of awareness. This study was again repeated after just a couple of years ago, maybe after about 8 years, I think right before the COVID pandemic, and the most common cause now was acne. So acne was the number one cause why people did not like wearing sunscreens. So are breakouts with sunscreen use a real issue? Why does this happen? Three reasons why the skin breaks out when getting onto a sunscreen. The first one is that sunscreen filters by nature are oily stuff. They are lipids and lipid based oily stuff, and they need to be dispersed in more oily stuff, what we call as an emulsion, with a lot of oil in some of water, and those oils together can be a problem for someone who already has an easy tendency to oiliness, greasiness and to breakouts. This problem over time has been addressed very well by an improvement in formulation techniques, and I expect that acne will soon lose its position as the number one reason for someone not liking sunscreens. The second part of the acne problem as to why people break out with sunscreens is that people tend to use a lot of moisturizers under sunscreen. This makes a lot of sense if your climate has a lower humidity in general, or if you live in a very cold place. But in most cases, the moisturizer itself tends to clog and congest the skin, and the sunscreen addition on top makes things worse. So if you have acne and you want to start a sunscreen, start it solo initially to see if the sunscreen agrees with you in the first place. Then after a couple of weeks, if the skin feels dry, only then you can add on an aqueous water-based moisturizer. Oil-based heavy creams and moisturizers have actually been studied to lower the SPFs of sunscreens. So it's the best is to stay with a light water-based moisturizer in general. This applies particularly if you have acne. The third reason for breakouts after starting sunscreen is a poor skincare routine overall. This may be that you don't really cleanse the skin completely at bedtime. It may mean that you're using too many conflicting products. It may mean that your scalp hygiene is not in great shape. Basically, all these are some of the general reasons for acne itself, and they're not going to go away just by themselves just because we added a sunscreen to the routine. Yeah, so it's a great step to start sunscreens, definitely, yes, and it's a great step to make them a part of your skincare routine. But ultimately, it's a clean, lean skin routine that will give you the best results overall. So that was about breakouts and why people don't like wearing sunscreen. So we addressed that. What's the next most common reason that people do not like using sunscreens? The next is appearance and tolerability. So if you look at it, chemical and mineral sunscreens feel heavy on the skin and may take some time getting used to. It's not very different from, say, learning to drive a cycle. It takes a little bit of getting used to, right? So white cast is a problem with some mineral sunscreens, especially those containing titanium, maybe to a lesser extent those containing zinc as well. However, there are many types and grades and finishes and textures of sunscreens nowadays. So it should be possible, not saying easily, not saying effortlessly, but it should definitely be possible to find a sunscreen that actually matches your tone with a little bit of effort and patience. It does take time to get the sunscreen that fits well on you, but trust me, with sunscreens being the main way to prevent photo aging, the time and effort that you put into finding an ideal sunscreen is absolutely totally worth it. The next main reason that people do not like wearing a sunscreen is the debate around physical and chemical sunscreens. We discussed a little bit of this in the earlier episode. And there's also concern about the safety of sunscreen ingredients overall. So, like we touched upon in the earlier episode, the difference between organic and inorganic. In the upcoming episodes, I'll talk to you more about regulations and filters and so on. But for now, we can move forward by avoiding filters that are implicated in human and eco-health concerns, and try to get on mineral filters which are considered FDA approved as safe and effective, what we call as GRASE, while actually continuing to explore the newer filters in vogue in the EU. Yet another reason why people do not like sunscreens is the reapplication problem. The FDA states that Sunscreens have to be applied every 2 hours, which is not practical unless you're doing a sun holiday and you can actually factor in the time to put on sunscreen every 2 hours. Now, the basis for this 2 hourly recommendation by the FDA last decade is still being debated because there are multiple newer studies which have actually demonstrated that sunscreens are stable on the skin of indoor workers even up to 8 hours, and in outdoor workers, the study showed a decline of only 32% at the end of 8 hours. So if you translate this into SPF, if you start out with an SPF of 40, you may still be left with an SPF of 27 at the end of 8 hours, which is an acceptable number for preventing photoaging for an Indian skin type person. Furthermore, in another study where the study subjects did activities simulating acting like they were at the beach for a day, including bathing and toweling, 40% of the SPF was retained after 8 whole hours, including bathing and toweling. So another study also showed the presence of up to 60% protection after 8 hours. Even within that 8 hours, they had actually had 90 minutes of water exposure and 30 minutes of exercise within those 8 hours. One other study showed that the SPF dropped from 50 to 30 with a 60% retention after 6 hours of sweating in a hot environment. In the same study, the SPF was found to hold steady for 6 hours in those who did not have sweating. One other study is there which concludes that a very water resistant sunscreen need not be applied once in every 2 hours. Sunscreens tend to accumulate in the skin, as shown in a research paper which went on to demonstrate that the UV protection factor was higher on day 5 as compared to day 1 with thrice daily application of sunscreens in all 5 days. This means there was some amount of sunscreen that stayed on the skin as compared to once daily application where they did not find any accumulation. Now there is a dilemma. Should we see this accumulation as better sun protection, or should we see this accumulation as a problem for potential absorption into the body? Now, with the data also coming in related to the accumulative toxicity of sunscreens, including endocrine receptor modulation, and given that we are primarily using sunscreens for preventing photoaging, it seems to be better to err on or to stay on the side of preventing product accumulation with lesser number of applications. For this, the sunscreen itself needs to be more durable and long lasting. Sunscreens are available now which can be, like as we say on the many studies, they can be water resistant for hours with well maintained SPF at the end of say 6 to 8 hours of an immersion test. Another point about reapplication is that, which is rather a very practical problem. For example, when you have eye makeup, etc., foundation and work, and you're all set for the day and you're working away happily for 4 hours, and then you realize that you'll have to get up and reapply the sunscreen, which is a very tricky job getting on if you're going to reapply over eye makeup. Some of us may not even have the space and the comfort for all of that. It's a very practical problem that many of us face, considering that most of us are no longer in the work from home mode. And recently, I held a survey on Instagram about the sunscreen habits of people, and it is truly interesting to note that over 65% of those who identified themselves as regular sunscreen users use sunscreen only once a day, and still they perceive themselves as regular sunscreen users. And even more funnily so, 17 participants who identified themselves as regular sunscreen users reported that they did not even use sunscreen once a day. So to balance the practicality of maintaining durable sun protection throughout the day against reapplication, what should you do? And again, you have to think about absorption as well. There are 5 research-backed suggestions to get past this. Use a high SPF sunscreen. High SPF sunscreens have been shown to maintain protection better than low SPF sunscreens, which are more suited for frequent reapplication. So you're better off with say a 40 SPF sunscreen as compared to a 15 SPF sunscreen for better durability. Second thing is sunscreen reapplication. Apply a first layer of sunscreen, then have a second application within 20 minutes to increase the staying power of your sunscreen. We could call this the double layer sunscreen rule. So third point is use sunscreen every day. As we saw, sunscreen protection increased with the same number of applications from day 1 to day 5, and so the protection thereon seems to be better with regular sunscreen use. Fourth point, mineral sunscreens are more resistant to UV-induced breakdown over time and are better for protection as compared to chemical sunscreens, which are a little bit more photo unstable and need further ingredients to stabilize them. So you might want to consider adding on a mineral sunscreen for the days when you are less likely to be able to reapply properly. Water-resistant sunscreens, fifth point. Water-resistant sunscreens have a longer staying power, and that's something that you can use compared to non-water-resistant sunscreens, especially if your sunscreen is very water-resistant. it is likely to have much more durability, especially if you're in an AC environment, as what we saw from the studies. So that's a discussion on the ways to get past the hurdles in your mind that may be preventing you from using sunscreen, because we know sunscreen is the basis for young and healthy skin. For the next episode, I will see you with the other practical questions that we want to learn more about on handling sunscreen usage, such as whether you can use a moisturizer under your sunscreen, should you apply a 2 finger worth amount of sunscreen really, is it okay to wear makeup over your sunscreen, and stuff like this. If you think any of this is relevant to you or you want to know more about this, please consider subscribing to the channel, and also let us know your questions and queries on practical problems that you face, which may not even be common problems but are very relevant problems with sunscreen use, in the comments, and I'll try to address them as much as I can. You take care, and I'll see you soon.